Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Michael Lee. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the University of Virginia. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce our distinguished speaker for the annual Myles H. Thaler Lecture, Professor Dr. Udo Weilacher of the Technical University of Munich. But before I provide a more detailed introduction for Professor Weilacher, I would like to say a few words about the Thaler Lecture Series, how it came to be an important part of the life of the School of Architecture here at UVA. Myles H. Thaler, who endowed the series, was a member of the first graduating class of the program in landscape architecture here at the University of Virginia. After receiving his degree in 1973, he embarked on a career as a landscape architect and was based in Washington, D.C. After a few years in private practice, he took a position as administrator of the Naval Observatory in 1979, caring for a landscape that included the residence of the Vice President of the United States. And shortly before his early death in 1991, the Thaler family left a bequest to the University of Virginia to fund this lecture series. That bequest reads in part, "The purpose of the fund is to bring to the School of Architecture nationally prominent scholars and practitioners to give public presentations on the subject of the meaning of the garden, in order to expand public awareness of the cultural significance throughout history of gardens, both public and private." The list of speakers over the years has included some of the most prominent figures in landscape architectural practice and theory, including Ian McHarg, Roberto Burle Marx, Martha Schwartz, and Michael van Valkenburg, to name but a few. Tonight, our distinguished guest joins that list. Professor Dr. Udo Weilacher is the chair of the Landscape Architecture and Industrial Landscape at the Technical University of Munich. It's a position which he has held since 2009. He studied landscape architecture as an undergraduate at that university, which was augmented with additional studies at the California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. And I discovered just over the last couple of days that we nearly lost him in these early days to a career in forestry. But are thankful that he chose the discipline of landscape architecture instead. I'm sure that would have been a very fine career. After graduation, Professor Weilacher became a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Karlsruhe, and then the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH, in Zurich. Now, in 2001, he completed his doctorate at ETH Zurich, where he was awarded the Medal for Outstanding Dissertation, which he wrote on the Swiss landscape architect Ernst Kramer. Dr. Weilacher was appointed Professor of Landscape Architecture and Design at the University of Hanover in 2002, and then served as its Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and Landscape Sciences from 2006 to 2008, and then in 2009 he accepted his current position in Munich. Professor Weilacher is the author of numerous internationally published books and essays. It's not an exaggeration to say that he is one of the most widely respected and frequently cited landscape theorists working today. He researches the links between modern landscape architecture, the visual arts, and garden design history in conjunction with forward-looking urban design landscapes, cultural landscapes, and the sustainable alteration of post-industrial landscapes. And his critical interpretations of major 20th century European landscape architects, such as Bernard Lassus and Dieter Kienast, one of his mentors, have set the standard for the field. Of his many books and articles, I will name only a few, just to give you a sense of their range. Between Landscape Architecture and Land Art, 1996, with a second edition after that. Visionary Gardens, The Modern Landscapes of Ernst Kramer. In Gardens, Profiles of Contemporary European Landscape Architecture, 2005, and then Syntax of Landscape, the Landscape Architecture of Peter Latz and Partners, 2008, the latter of which was awarded the J.B. Jackson Book Prize of the Foundation for Landscape Studies in New York in 2011. Professor Weilacher has served on juries for a number of international design competitions and is a frequent participant in symposia and exhibitions with an international reach. Among his many other responsibilities, he is a member of the International Doctoral College Spatial Research Lab, an interdisciplinary initiative involving 5 European universities. This initiative, which to my ears sounds truly amazing, is training the next generation of European PhD students in the design disciplines through intensive mentorship and collaboration. One of the reasons that we were able to entice Professor Weilacher to Charlottesville is that he is currently enjoying a 1-month Mellon residency at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. So for a couple of days, he has left the enclosing walls of paradise for the forests and fields of Central Virginia and the academical village of Thomas Jefferson, which is perhaps a different kind of paradise. We are thus very pleased and grateful to have our distinguished guest with us tonight to speak about the theme of landscape structuralism. So please join me in welcoming the 2017 Myles H. Thaler Lecturer, Professor Dr. Udo Weilacher.
Thank you very much, Michael. I was not nervous, but after your introduction, I really got nervous. Thanks a lot for your sweet exaggerations. But it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. And I'm very pleased that I've been invited by you. So thanks again, Michael. That was fabulous that you got me here. And thanks to the whole faculty for having me here tonight to share with you a few thoughts on structuralism, on landscape structuralism. Michael just pointed out that I'm coming from Munich, sort of attention advertisement. This is Munich, and the Faculty of Architecture is located right here. And I have the honor to deliver greetings from our dean from the Department of Architecture, Professor Hannelore Deubzer, who said, you know, that there is a treatment of exchanging students here with the UVA, and she would be very pleased if we could revive that tradition of exchanging students. It would be really a pleasure to have some of you guys over soon. Well, about 3 weeks ago, Michael said that I was going to this paradise here, Washington, D.C., invited by John Beardsley. It was really great, and I'm able to spend 4 weeks there concentrating on research in the wonderful library. It's a fabulous place. You obviously all know this place. It is a paradise indeed. And the marvelous gardens are really a luxury. And when I spent the last weeks there, I had to think about my old friend and former professor, the Swiss landscape architect Dieter Kienast, who once said that the garden is the last luxury of our days because it demands what has become most rare and most precious in our society: time, care, and space. At Dumbarton Oaks, or in an environment like this here, which is indeed another paradise that I was able to visit right now, it's very clear what that statement means, actually. Being here, I hope you appreciate the fact that this is one of our last luxuries of our days. And I'm very sure that Myles Thaler had this quality of gardens in mind when he designed the meditation garden on campus. So the garden is the last luxury, and I think it is fabulous that you have this lecture here dedicated to this person and his appreciation also for gardens. Dieter Kienast admitted once that this definition of luxury that he is referring to here was very much influenced by the German philosopher and writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger. Hans Magnus Enzensberger published in 1996 an article on which was called Reminiscence of Abundance, and he said in this article, in the future, luxury will turn away from the superfluous and aspire to the necessary, which must be feared to be only available for a few. No duty-free shop will provide what is really important. And now it comes, and students know exactly what we're talking about, free available time. You know how luxurious that is. Deliberately self-determined attention. What a luxury to know, I want to concentrate on this. Especially space for free movement. Silence. Really a luxury. Intact environment and safety. So Peter Lutz and Dieter Kienast, I'm going to talk about Peter Lutz a little bit later, we're referring to this definition. And I think that makes very clear why Dieter Kienast was convinced that the garden is the last luxury of our days today, because he's referring back to that. Quite frankly, in gardens like these, it's very tempting to forget about the real problems we have to deal with out there. Because more and more people live in environments in our growing cities where gardens like this are more than a luxury of the future. They will probably never be able to enjoy these qualities out there. And the colleagues in landscape architecture are very well aware of the fact that we have to take care that we no longer focus our attention on designing beautiful gardens, but we have to really tackle some very complex problems in our living environments out there. The problem is very clear from my point of view, but I always have to remind myself what we have to deal with. More than ever before, we are confronted with the task to plan complex cultural landscapes. Especially landscapes in transformation are putting us before great difficulties. And for me, the city, by the way, is just a special manifestation of landscape, a special form of landscape, but I will explain this a little bit later. In landscape architecture, and that's the challenge, by the way, this is Munich. This is not the postcard image of Munich. This is Munich where it gets transformed, where it gets changed, where it's not so, beautiful for the postcards. In landscape architecture, we have to find appropriate design and planning strategies to manage these kind of landscapes. So the challenge is to deal with complexity and dynamics of these landscapes. And our aim in landscape architecture, from my point of view, is the creation of living environments. I brought a photo from Washington, D.C., planning living environments that maintain their ability to change and grow. Change and grow is very important, without losing their identity. That's something that I'm really convinced of. We have to deal with landscapes that secure changeability, versatility, and viability, but the big thing is a living landscape must be allowed to change its face without losing its face. I really love that sentence. A landscape has to be allowed to change its face without losing its face. We'll talk a little bit later about that, what that means. That means, as a matter of fact, a living landscape must be allowed to change its face without losing its face. But how do we achieve that? That's the big question. What method or strategy is appropriate to make sure that a landscape can change its face without losing its face? And here's the hypothesis. And I told in the design studio today that I love hypothesis because it has a certain kind of provocation going with it. Here's the thesis. We're faced with the necessity of evolving structures and forms which can develop in time, which can remain a unity and maintain the coherence of the components at all stages of their growth. The absence of this must lead to self-destruction. Now, to be honest with you, this is not a hypothesis that was developed by myself. This is one that has been developed about 60 years ago. This is not new. And I'm afraid I won't tell you any big news tonight. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of I offer you a way to read things that we already know, maybe in a little bit different way. This thesis comes from Willem van Bodegraven, a Dutch architect and known for his work for structuralism. And we have to be very careful that the term structure that he uses in this sentence here is not used in the way that we normally use structure. And I need to explain that in a few moments. When I propose that landscape structuralism might be a valuable strategy to develop living landscapes that can change their face without losing their face, I, of course, need to clarify my understanding of landscape. And of course, I also need to clarify what I understand by structure. This is very tricky because I had to find out that if a German uses the term Landschaft, landscape, it's very tempting for us to just translate it to landscape. But I learned, you have to correct me, dear colleagues, because you probably know it a lot better, that Landschaft in Germany can also be wilderness. And if Americans use the term landscape, they normally tend to think that it's always a designed environment. So that's something we have to keep in mind. But terms are very important for our work. Maybe, and I have to apologize to the colleagues here, the professors, talking about the definition of landscape seems to be very simple, maybe even ridiculous to you. But in the last 25 years of teaching at different universities and schools of architecture and landscape architecture, I got confronted with so many neologisms, with so many theories trying to describe scenes like this. This is a photograph, and this photograph of a, well, environment, let's call it like that. And the question is, what is the appropriate term to describe such a scene? How do we want to call it? Is this an industrial area? Or would you rather call it a city? Do you think that in-between city or Zwischenstadt is an appropriate term for that? Or would you rather prefer to talk about a cultural landscape? Do we rather want to talk about an urban cultural landscape? Or a transformation landscape? Or an infrastructural landscape? Or, don't worry, I could go on for hours. But I won't do that. Because, we could make this little experiment trying for quite a while to find the right expression, the one appropriate term that describes that scene perfectly. But I very much doubt that this will be a successful experiment. But sometimes I have the feeling we're spending a lot of time in doing these experiments. It's very interesting, though, that while we are changing the label for these images, and I hope you notice that, the landscape that we're looking at seems to change its meaning permanently. Our way of reading is influenced by the way how we label this scene. And that's very interesting for me. We're looking at it in a different way. What we're actually hoping for is that there is out there one term, a term that will not only allow us to describe this given scene, but we expect and we hope that one of these terms will deliver a kind of an ideal concept of how to develop these interesting landscapes or this complex of man-made structures into a good living environment. And we talked about it in the crit recently, that this should be our main aim, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves that our main aim is really to create valuable living environments for man and nature. Whatever we do, that should be our main aim. I really believe that according to this main objective of our work, the experts in the German Ruhr region did an excellent job when they named this situation here simply Emscher Landscape Park, or in German, Emscher Landschaftspark. Why? Whoever have been responsible for coining this term in reality understood the wide-ranging meaning and the deep power of the good old term landscape. No matter how many neologisms are out there, this term has quite a power, and I'm very proud to use that term. Given the challenge to change man-made landscapes, especially so-called destroyed landscapes, into valuable living environments, I think it's absolutely necessary and very important to work with a term, to work with a future-oriented understanding of landscape in accordance with the current condition of our society. The term changes because our society changes permanently. Whoever called this scene a landscape was very ambitious and intelligent, because not so long ago, no one, at least in Germany and in Europe, would have ever called something like this a landscape. No one. A landscape for centuries was something that had nothing to do with the city. Landscape was the natural opponent to the city, as a matter of fact, and at the same time, an image of desire, especially in the Romantic era at the end of the 18th century, not only in Europe, I think. This was a landscape at that time. Caspar David Friedrich, one of the most renowned painters in Germany, did these landscape paintings at this time. And in his paintings, he turned landscapes into scenes of desire for an ideal world. These were the ideal images of what a landscape was supposed to be. Painters like him had a great influence on our perception of landscape today. And if you look at this situation here very carefully, it's not wilderness, it's the cultivated landscape, it's agricultural land. 184 years later, in 1991, the German philosopher and geographer Gerhard Hart did some interesting linguistic studies, and he was trying to find out, what do people understand if they talk about landscape? What is their understanding? And he came up with a very interesting research result. He said, a landscape that deserves that name, that was his finding by asking people, the true, sound, humane landscape is silent, beautiful, bucolic, green, healthy, and recreative, harmonious, manifold, and aesthetical. This landscape is a symbol for a grown and deeply rooted culture against false progress and a meaningless civilization. At the same time, this landscape is the object, the ideal counterpart for the experience of nature, of the compassionate and soulful modern subject. That was his finding in 1991. Very interesting, by doing these linguistic studies. Hart found out that this kind of understanding of landscape is not only typical for ordinary people, but many of us, many landscape architects and urban planners, or planners generally spoken, are also referring to these positive connotations of the term landscape. The perception of landscape in a certain culture group is strongly coined by almost similar ideal conceptions. And these traditional conceptions of what a landscape is all about can be positive if they reinforce our positive understanding of what we see in front of us. But they can be very critical or even negative if they propose, this term proposes an ideal concept, and these idealized images of what a landscape is supposed to be can be very critical, especially in our cultural surrounding. Well, only a few years, just look at this scenery once again, and you'll see that there's a loving couple in the middle of this scene here, hiding away in this beautiful landscape. It's part of the iconography of this area. Landscape, the traditional understanding, at least in Germany, was very much described in a definition by a German philosopher, Joachim Ritter, in 1963, and this was supposed the only valid definition of what landscape is all about, and even people today sometimes think that this is still the only valid definition of what landscape is all about. Look at this here. Joachim Ritter was proposing in 1963, landscape is nature becoming aesthetically present in the gaze of a sensitive and sentient observer, not the fields outside the city, not the rivers as a boundary, channel of trade, or a problem for bridge builders, not the mountains and plains of the shepherds and caravans or the searchers of oil are as such landscape. They only become landscape if man freely enjoys the sight without any practical interest to be in nature as itself. Very interesting. From his point of view, a used landscape was not a landscape, and that's what many people agree upon, even today. Now, Caspar David Friedrich's painting is exactly in tune with this kind of definition by Joachim Ritter. And in his painting, as I said, you'll find a loving couple in the middle of a cultivated landscape, and I think that's very interesting. Only a few years later, the industrial landscape gradually invaded the scene. And a few years later, paintings looked a little bit different, but only for a very short period of time, you could see paintings like this one here. This is a painting by William Wilde, and it shows the industrialized city, heavily industrialized city of Manchester. And this painting was done for Queen Victoria. Her Majesty was very proud of the blooming cotton industry in this city, and the growing economic power of the empire was very important. And the enormous population density in these industrial cities, as you all know from history, also created a lot of very horrible problems. In Wilde's romantic painting, the industrial city is dominating the background, as you can see here, plunged into soft backlight, and in the foreground, we still find the bucolic landscape with a loving couple, but now it's here. But it's still the same kind of vision. The lovers seem to enjoy the scene in spite of the industrial smoke in the background, because it's plunged into this very romantic light. For us, by the way, it's very easy to find our orientation in this world, in this painting, because there are very clear boundaries painted here. And just to point them out, this is how this painting is composed. We find the city, the so-called urban landscape in the background. We have the cultivated landscape in the middle ground, and there's something like the natural landscape or the wilderness in the foreground. But the boundary between the city and the landscape is pretty clear. The point is that especially the boundary between the city and the environment is momentarily not existing anymore in our landscapes. And that's a bit of a problem, because especially the boundary that's pretty clear is responsible for orientation. Orientation is another key term that we in landscape architecture have to deal with. In his book, Cognition and Reality, the American psychologist Ulrich Neisser scientifically proves the importance of orientation for every human being. It puts you at great risk to lose orientation. It might be fun if you get drunk on a Friday night, but sooner or later you should find back to orientation. And that's never getting orientation again can be very frightening. As a result, it is one of the most important challenges to ensure an aesthetic quality of landscape, from my point of view, offering orientation to every human being, a landscape that offers all necessary functional and ecological qualities, but no orientation is unlivable for man. So it's one of the tasks that we have out there to give a landscape a face or secure an existing face. Now, what I did here is something a little bit strange. I said, well, let's compare these two photos. It's very interesting, by the way, that the wind is coming from the same direction, but that was just by accident. So if we compare these photos from 2007 and the painting from William Wilde directly, we find a lot of similarities, but also some very distinctive differences. One of the most important differences, of course, is the fact that there's hardly any chance for intuitive orientation on the right-hand side, because in comparison to this world 150 years ago, the clear boundaries between city and landscape was blurred. We're talking about something that is not good for orientation any longer, and this is only one of the major problems we have to deal with. During the last century, a new totality of all aspects of a region, that refers to the definition by Humboldt, appeared in this industrial area here. A new landscape emerged, and we have to acknowledge, whether we like it or not, that this kind of environment is the living environment for about 5 million people. So we cannot just ignore it and say, well, it's not a landscape and it doesn't matter, or we don't care about it. We have to take care of it. And orientation in this constantly changing landscape is getting more and more difficult for the people living there. A landscape without identity, without a face, cannot provide the necessary orientation. That's what I said. But on the other hand, that's what I also pointed out. A landscape that can't change its face is dead. It's going to be turned into a museum, and it will not be able to survive. So what can we do? How do we deal with this constant change? This is, by the way, not a photo montage. This is really a landscape, a sign saying that this part of landscape is protected by law. Now, this is a collage, of course. And what I'm trying to say is there is no way back. There's no way back to these old ideal images of landscape. That's why we have to find new ways to give a face to landscapes without turning them into beautiful but lifeless images. And I think in your design studio that I've seen today, it was just one of these challenges. You deal with a landscape that we cannot describe with the old idealized patterns anymore. So how do we give it a new image, and how do we describe the scenery without always comparing it to the old-fashioned way of looking at landscapes? There's no way back. Many new landscapes do not match these ideal images that we're dealing with. And in many regions in Europe, and you probably have the same problems here too, we're faced with this challenge. If people refer to images like this here, and that's the outskirts of Munich, as a landscape, we have to accept that this reference is a great progress. It's wonderful that people are, talking about this and call it a landscape, because it means that the spectator is probably no longer fixed to certain ideal images, and there is hopefully no need to press these kind of landscapes into certain static new images, because that would actually kill them. Whenever we are concerned with the design and redesign of landscapes, we need to rediscover the true value of the existing, that's for sure. And we have to build our new design on the basis of the existing. It would be horrible to always wipe out everything and completely come up with new understandings. In some cases that might help, but not in every case. And that's why I think the term landscape and what you understand by is very important. You know this definition here, and I like it very much. A landscape is not a natural feature of the environment, but a synthetic space, a man-made system of spaces superimposed on the face of the land, functioning and evolving, not according to natural laws, but to serve a community. For the collective character of the landscape is one thing that all generations and all points of view have agreed upon. This definition, developed by John Brinkerhoff Jackson, as you know, one of the founders of the American landscape studies, is, from my point of view, one of the most advanced today, and we're beginning, at least in the European range, maybe it's already done here, to accept this as one of the trend-setting understandings of what landscape is all about. And I really like to compare these two definitions by Ritter on the right-hand side and J.B. Jackson on the left-hand side. And just the first sentence, Ritter saying landscape is nature, and he's saying a landscape is not a natural feature. It's incredible how this definition, maybe that's absolutely not new for you, but in our European environment, it is really new, how this shook up our profession. What do you mean? Landscape is not nature. What do you mean? It's a system of spaces, man-made system of spaces superimposed on the face of the country. This is really something that is making a change. If we do accept Jackson's definition of landscape, and that it's not nature, not even a natural phenomenon, we have to take the responsibility for all landscape, and we don't have to differentiate between what nature was preparing and didn't touch and the touched landscape. It's needless to discuss if, for example, infrastructure can create landscape. No, with reference to this definition, infrastructure is landscape naturally, and it's part of our work. And that's why I like about it, because this new definition is not trying to differentiate between things we have to take care of and other things we don't have to take care of. Unfortunately, this definition forces us to look at the whole, at the complete image, the complete picture, not differentiate that. J.B. Jackson adds, landscape is not a scenery, it's not a political unit, it's really no more than a collection, a system of man-made spaces on the surface of the earth. So he repeats that. Whatever its shape or size, it is never simple and natural space, a feature of the natural environment. It is always artificial, always synthetic, always object to sudden and unpredictable change. We were looking at one of the projects in the afternoon, and I think if you, as a student, work with this definition of landscape, it will open up a whole lot of possibilities for you, and it will not limit you to a rather old-fashioned traditional approach that is linked to the other definition that I've shown you. And by the way, nonlinearity, emergence, and surprise, you probably all know that. These are the key attributes of complex systems. because landscape is the complex system we can deal with, and that's why it's so difficult to handle that. And from that point of view, the city is just a variation of the landscape. My colleagues in architecture don't like that if I say that. That for me, the city is just a special form of landscape. But if you adapt this definition that I've just shown you, it is just a special variation. So I hope after telling you all this, you understand maybe now a little bit better if I talk about landscape structuralism, how I understand what I mean by using the term landscape. That's very important for me, because if you don't understand this, it's really hard to understand what the whole structure or the whole concept is all about. So let's take a look at the second part of this landscape structuralism and think a little bit or talk a little bit about structure. Well, structure, as I said, it's important to understand that structuralist architects, and I'm referring to the architects, and here you see some of the most important figures of structuralism architecture in the Netherlands. It's Aldo van Eyck and Herman Herzberger, Piet Bloem, and so on. You probably know these names. These were the driving forces of structuralism in the Netherlands, and I'm referring to their approach. That's very important. I'm not referring too much to the philosophical definition of structuralism, because that is leading us into a labyrinth of terms and configurations. We'll never get out of that. And I'm very happy that, I think it was Gilles Deleuze who sometimes said, a theory should be like a good toolbox. If you cannot use it, forget it. Who needs theory if it doesn't help us to understand the world better and to read the land, to read our environment better? I don't care. So quite frankly, maybe I'm too lazy, but I don't spend that much time trying to figure out what these guys tell me if I cannot work with it. So, okay, sorry about that. The anthropologists will probably blame me for saying that. So let's come back to that. The structuralist, how the Dutch colleagues understood it. Architects in the 1960s, they were not using structure in terms of construction. That's very important to understand. Structure in terms of construction was used mainly during the 17th and 18th century in a constructivist meaning. That means structure at that time was really referred to as a stabilizing, rigid system that stabilizes, architecture or built environments. In these days, the contemporaries of Giovanni Piranesi were reflecting on architecture intensively, and they used the term structure, as I said, exclusively in the sense of the term construction. But I'm not using the term in this respect. This understanding is still popular today, but it has changed fundamentally, especially with regard to modern functionalism, because we have to understand that the structuralists in architecture had kind of an enemy. These were the functionalist architects. Functionalism, I don't know if you know that movie, Jacques Tati, Playtime, one of my favorite if you want to understand how absurd functionalism can be. You should really watch it if you have a chance to. Functionalism always demanded specific spaces for specific purposes. That was the general idea. This was leading to environments unable to change and adapt. That's the problem. If you're always designing specific places for specific purposes, you have to be aware of the fact that you're creating a very rigid system. And that's for you as young designers, I think, very important. The modern city was anatomically dissected into a number of lifeless specialisms in order to optimize the living conditions and get rid of some of the urban chaos. Well, the result of this approach was quite a catastrophe. It is well known from history of modern urban planning what problematic consequences have resulted, for example, also from the shelters of Athens, which was a good idea in the beginning. It was really a good idea to improve people's living environments, but it turned out to be, not very successful. And because the architects were asking for partitioning the modern city according to key purposes like housing, recreation, work, and traffic. The problem with functionalism was that it did not take a holistic approach, but tried to cut down the living system into many little pieces. They were trying to optimize each single compartment, but that did not work out. this living environment is a city is not a machine. A landscape is not a machine you can optimize. There is no way to do that. It's far too complex. And man, and that's very important, is not a rational factor to be fully calculated. Why am I saying this? Because momentarily, at least in Europe, we discuss this subject here. We talk a lot about ecosystem services. From my point of view, it's very critical that we currently ask exactly for this kind of purely economically based, purely functionally based perspective on our environment. We're talking about green infrastructure, we're talking about ecosystem services, and we try to solve our environmental problems by attaching price tags to nature and all its components. It's absolutely interesting. And you see here price tag. You can now calculate exactly the ecosystem services of a wetland area, for example, and you come up with a number, and this enables you to organize, to discuss a lot better. Or you can say here, insectivorous birds and how much do they cost in Costa Rica, 50% pest invested. So it says here's a lot of money that this is worth. This is a new tendency, and I don't know how far it's advanced. Well, actually, it was partly invented also here. But the problem is we also have so-called cultural ecosystem services. Can you imagine? We're trying to put a price tag on nature by its cultural value. So what is the cultural value of a vineyard on a sunny southern slope? How much money are you willing to invest it? Or as an ecology professor of mine said, how much would you like to pay for a bird singing in the morning? €2.50 or $3.80 or what's the. So that's for me a very, very tricky situation. That means we are buying into a way of thinking that was clearly once identified as the cause, the real cause for environmental problems. And now we're beginning to dissect landscape and nature again into compartments. We attach price tags to it, and we think we can solve the problem. I understand my colleagues, of course, who are sitting in the communities and have discussions with other interest groups, and they all argue on economic basis. And here we are, the pure landscape architects, and we don't have numbers that we can argue with. It's so much easier to say, well, but the value is so much higher. But the problem is, and I gave this a kind of this lecture to my colleagues at the German Association of Landscape Architects, and they were so mad at me that I was criticizing that, because they said, well, it's the only way we can argue. We're always the ones who have no chance in the discussions because everybody can talk about money, but we cannot, and so on. And I said, sorry. And when you started studying landscape architecture, I think everybody knew that you would not be able to argue in economic terms. Everybody knew in the beginning that it will be a hard fight to talk about values that are not economically 100% secure. So why do you complain right now? It seems to be an easy way out, but I think it's not. I think it's very difficult. Maybe that's the reason why the structuralist architects are so interesting from my point of view, because in the 1960s, they fiercely criticized the purely functionalistic approach to planning and design, and they defined the term structure completely different. They said structure is a complete set of relationships in which the elements can change, but in such a way that these remain independent of the whole and retain their meaning. The whole is independent of its relationship to the elements. The relationships between the elements are more important than the elements themselves. The elements are interchangeable, but not the relationships. So the most important aspect of this definition was that structure is not something static, but structure is something that's about relations, interrelations. It's not about objects, it's about the relation between the objects. That was for them most important. And it's quite clear that this definition is very strongly related to concepts in structuralism you'll find in linguistics or anthropology. That's where we meet again. And as a matter of fact, you can only understand, I think, this structuralistic approach if we accept that we're dealing here with some kind of language. From my point of view, landscape architecture is a language. That's what I'm trying to tell my students. You're learning a new language. And as you well know, if you learned a language, it doesn't make sense to just learn vocabulary. It's the question how the terms are related to each other in order to produce some kind of sense. That's the idea. So it doesn't matter, how many plants you know. It's the question how you compose them and how you put them in relation to. It's not the elements themselves. Or as Deleuze said once, and that's why I like to quote him because this is something I can understand. He said, in fact, landscape is the only thing that can properly be said to have structure, be it an esoteric or even nonverbal language. There is a structure of the unconscious only to the extent that the unconscious speaks and is language. There is a structure of bodies only to the extent that bodies are supposed to speak with a language, which is one of the symptoms. Even things possesses a structure only insofar as they maintain a silent discourse, which is the language of science. So the key term is language is the only thing that can properly be said to have structure. And that's why I'm convinced if we deal with landscape architecture as a non-verbal language, we are communicating with people out there with our designs. We're sending messages, and the question is, are people able to understand these messages? If that's true, then of course, landscape naturally has a structure, and that's why we have to look at that issue very closely. Now, if you look at these buildings by the architects of the 1960s and 70s, like here by Hermann Herzberger, the Centraalbeheer in Apeldoorn in the Netherlands, you might have your doubts. Did these buildings really meet criteria mentioned in the definition that I've just quoted? Well, the problem is the non-material connections in these buildings were quite structuralist, but if you work with concrete, steel, glass, or brick, you are inevitably limited in your flexibility and your changeability and viability. So the architects had really a hard time to transfer this idea of structuralism into their work. And that's why many architects gave up this construction. The other point is, if architecture is nothing else but a construction of spaces that are flexible in their use, it's hard to create objects, and objects are easier to sell. Easier to sell than structures, right? But if we look at landscape with the same definition, suddenly this definition makes a lot of sense. So landscape structuralism is different from architectural structuralism, naturally, simply, and that's only one reason, because we're dealing with a living superorganism, which is very complex, a complex system of living spaces. So that's why I think, sometimes we find approaches in another faculty or in another, in another realm. And it's sometimes interesting to see if we can work with that and make something more out of it. And that's what I'm proposing today, actually. So this definition, from my point of view, it's very well adapted to our current understanding of landscape as a living network of relationships. And these relations are relevant in terms of economy, ecology, but even more important, and maybe most important, in terms of sociology. And I'm afraid sometimes we tend to forget about the sociological aspect of what we're doing here. And by the way, from ecology, we learned that our understanding for complexity of material and immaterial relationships is essential for designing or working in landscape architecture. Decades ago, the architects in structuralism pointed out that there are certain rules to be respected in order to protect the viability of living networks. And I'm convinced that it's really high time today to carefully revisit these principles of structuralism and incorporate them in an enlarged concept that I propose of landscape structuralism, especially because we're currently, as I said, at high risk of getting caught up again in the dangerous belief in functional mechanisms. I don't know, at German universities momentarily, I'm a bit afraid that we're talking so much about processes, about process management, and so on. And this is all necessary. Okay, that's fine. But we have to be really careful that we don't get caught up in this functionalistic approach to landscape This is why I'm giving you this short lecture today. So let's look at the recommendations by the structuralist. Again, it's a proposal, okay? This is just to have you think about it. It's not that I'm, want to sell anything, but it's like, think about it. If you can work with it and take Deleuze, if that method is for you something you can really work with, use it. If you think it's not worth anything, forget about it and have a nice Friday evening, okay? So number one is, the structuralist said, respect the fundamental principles of human existence and the power of archetypes. Human principles and the power of archetypes. And they were referring to images like that. This is just some arbitrary image. And said, the archetype, you see exactly what the archetype is all about. The houses and the circle surrounding this situation. Archetypes, the structuralists believed very much in archetypes because they said, we have to make sure that what we communicate out there is understandable to people in all cultures, at all times, under all conditions. And the archetypes are forms that, make sure that communication is going on, because they are almost like anchors that help us to immediately and intuitively read certain environments. And that's not by, don't get me wrong, I don't think that Catherine Gustafson was thinking about, working with this Kenya images, but it is an archetypal form. And under a structuralistic point of view, you can say, yes, it is a good way of communicating with people because there's intuitive reading going on. I'm not talking about the quality of the material and so on. It's all wonderful, no problem and so on. I'm just talking about one aspect and trying to make it a little bit more understandable what they mean by archetypes and human conditions. The second point was avoid pure functionalistic, sectoral, and strongly formal orientation in planning and design. Again, this was all stated in the 60s. It's really nothing new, but I think it's interesting to look at it again. So avoid pure functionalistic. I would like to underline the pure. Of course, we have to think about functions. And again, it's the question, what do you understand by function? Are we talking about purpose or function? For me, there is a big difference between purpose and function. But anyway, that's another story. So avoid the pure functionalistic, sectoral, and strongly formal orientation in planning and design. And the third one was accept the existing and isochronal. That means consider historical and contemporary structures as equally valuable. That was another finding by the structuralists that they said, for communication, it doesn't really matter if the things you find out there are of historical value or contemporary value, as long as they help to establish a network, a communication, use them both, which is very interesting. Because it says, don't say all the historical structures are wonderful and we preserve them and all the contemporary is worth nothing. No, for society, we have to look at these things equally. I was trying to find a few images to make this a little bit more clear, but this one, for example, is, avoid the pure functionalistic approach in planning and design. And you can see here, this was once a very functionalistic space. It was used for storing coal. You had the lecture by Peter Lutz quite a while ago, but maybe you remember. And now it's not changing the form. It's not changing the pure function, but it's opening up this space for new interpretation. It's a kind of new language that's done by just putting these things here into the wall. And suddenly it's a landscape that's used by people in a completely different way. By the way, the Alpine Club of Germany has the biggest section in this former industrial area, and they all have their training grounds in this former industrial area. So this is another way of reading the situation. Looking at things synchronically, again, that was an approach that Peter Lutz is working a lot with, and I think the landscape park use work not in Germany. If you don't know it, you should really get a little bit into it, because for me, this whole project is almost like a, it's like a handbook how to work with the structuralist approach, with the landscape structuralist approach. And I underline, it's the landscape structuralist approach. It's not the philosophical structuralist approach. And what it does here, what it shows here in this graph is, he didn't differentiate between old structures and new structures, but he says, to make a landscape come alive, to establish the face of a landscape, it's necessary to look at these features by their quality and their value for communication, and not so much by their value whether they're historically interesting or not. If you want to establish a living landscape, this is the synchronical and the synchronical approach to these structures. The most famous example, as I said here, is this landscape park. The next 2 points were promote and reinforce the changeability, viability, and versatility of structural networks. This is, again, you can only understand this if you don't refer to the old-fashioned understanding of structure as something stable, rigid, unchangeable. No, structure in terms of communication lines, communication network means we have to make sure that they are alive, that they can change, that they can adapt. But it's important to stabilize landscape in that way. So this is what is meant by promote and reinforce the changeability, viability. Nothing more dangerous than rigid structures that are not able to change and adapt to the conditions that are permanently changing out there. But remember the slogan, and I love that slogan, a landscape has to be able to change its ways without losing its face. So that is asking for the elements that stabilize a certain quality out there. And the fifth point is create polyvalent spaces in order to allow the free adoption of structures, very important. Polyvalent, valent, values, poly, many values. Try to establish spaces that have value in many different kinds. In Europe, we're now really getting trained to do that because we have a lot of new cultures coming into Europe. And I'm very happy about that, about the influx of many new cultures coming into Europe. But we have to learn as landscape architects that these people come in with their own cultural understanding, and we have to make sure that the spaces we create there, especially the public open spaces, have to be polyvalent. That means they have to be open for different interpretations, no matter what cultural or, what belief you have or what other background you have. You have to create spaces that are able to be value for everybody. That's what's meant by polyvalent spaces. Just one little example. It's a very new project by Fetch Partner Landscape Architects in the middle of Zurich. Another project you could talk for hours, but that's one of the most important places, and it's designed very, very minimalistic. It's in front of the Opera House, you can see here. And it is essentially working with a lot of archetypes, like, the group of trees is an archetype. Everybody knows exactly how to read that landscape and how to live in that landscape. You don't have to put up signs and say, please sit in the shade of the trees here, because it is very simple, and sometimes it is very simple. And at the same time, it's a polyvalent space, and that's something that makes this project so strong, because it can be used in many different ways, in many different purposes. It's an open, stage for people to celebrate daily life in many different ways. And I know many of you will think well, I've heard that before. That's nothing new. Yes, it is not new. Well, all I'm saying is reconsider it and don't, run too much or don't follow too much the neologisms put out there. So in this place can be easily, in wintertime, it's turned into, Christmas market, no problem. Unfortunately, I know many colleagues that say, well, this is impossible, and it's ruining my design, and it's not used anymore, this is not what I want, and so on. But if you want to establish a structure that stabilizes landscape, you have to make sure that there are nodes in this structure that can be used in many different ways. Polyvalent, many values in many different ways. It's very interesting, by the way, that plaza is used so heavily momentarily by all kinds of interest groups that in the city of Zurich, the community passed a law restricting the number of events on this plaza to keep the plaza open for the public. And this is, again, you have to make sure that people can use these public spaces, and because then they get part of the society, and then they begin to stabilize the society as a network. That means these places also reflect a certain kind of quality that a society has. And the last point is emphasize communication as the structuring factor. Now, communication not only in terms of speaking with each other or writing back and forth or sending SMS or WhatsApp or whatever, but communication of information and material in the widest sense. Communication is very important. If you want to build up a structure that really will survive over the centuries, then make sure that it has a commutative quality to it, that it's important for some exchange of information or goods and so on. So, and I think if you look at this project here, for example, okay, I showed it last week as a land art project, but at the same time in Berlin, this is such a valuable open space in the network, in the open space network of Berlin, because this space is about communication. And it is in the mental map of the people because it's such a communicative space. And from my point of view, you could easily look at the Highline project and talk about a communication line getting reinforced by giving even more infrastructure to make communication possible. It's moving through the city. It's a line that is used for communication, but it's also a line that puts certain quarters in the city in relation to each other. It's beginning to communicate, and this communicating quality is something I think is very important. Now, slowly but surely coming to an end. This is, as I find out, the first detailed map of a mammal's neural network. The first detailed map, you can see here, it's the Allen Mouse Brain Connectivity Atlas, and I was fascinated by this image, quite frankly, even though I really don't understand all the details. But it is, as I said, the most detailed rendering of interconnections in any mammalian brain yet. It traces connections between tiny voxels and brain tissue containing between 100 and 500 neurons, but it's only part of it. Science is not there yet to really make a complete mapping of the brain. I would like to finish my presentation with a conclusion that it is, of course, risky to dissect such a complex building of interconnected systems and divide it up into a blue, a green, a yellow, or red functional modules. At least that's what we should have learned from catastrophes of the purely purpose-oriented functionalism. So it's very risky. And I think, and I also like this visualizations, maybe you know the Harrisons, or Parker Harrisons, and their experiments here. And I really love this image because, you know, we're trying to cut out a piece in order to understand it better, and we don't realize what's happening if we cut the last connections. So landscape in such a complex network of structures is not just a package of two-dimensional layers. And if we try to cut the network into functional parts, we are putting the superorganism of a landscape at high risk. Landscape, from my point of view, is not an infrastructure. I'm sorry about that. That's why I'm having a trouble with talking about green infrastructure. I don't think it can be planned in sectors, but it's a compound of natural and artificial elements. It's infra and suprastructures. It's not just infrastructure. And it's closely interwoven to a living whole. And I think it's our task as landscape architects to take responsibility for this living superorganism, that's not you for you, in an intelligent way and in interdisciplinary cooperations. That's why I think you're so lucky to work here at an architecture department, because the interdisciplinary approach, and that's what we also learned from our doctoral college that we're running, you mentioned it, it's really great, is we can only deal with these things if we're able to really interconnect with other disciplines. To me, but you don't have to share this point of view, but to me, landscape structuralism seems to be a good strategy to create, establish, and stabilize living networks. And that's what I'm interested in as landscape architecture. Thank you very much. Well, sorry for clinging too much to my manuscript. That's normally not my way. If I talk German, I'm a lot more relaxed. But since I'm not a native speaker, I need that help. So I have to apologize for that. Please.
Well, thank you for a marvelous lecture. It's very thought-provoking. I can think of maybe 10 questions I'd like to
I
ask you.
know.
But I'll just ask one. The principles of structuralism that you outline, the first one has to do with archetypes. And I'd like to know a little bit more about how you define archetypes. It sounds like there's some sort of instinctual predisposition, perhaps unconscious, to create certain forms for human habitation. Sounds a little bit Jungian, if I can use that. And I know in the 60s, Jung's psychology of the archetypes was very, very
Exactly. It is exactly referring to that.
It is
that
Jungian.
Yeah.
So
it is that there are certain forms that are existing in our subconscious level, and that are, you don't have to explain what it's all about. It's like inherited knowledge, more or less. And everybody in this world knows what a circle is all about, or a square is all about. You don't have to explain it. But it refers to Carl Gustav Jung, that's true. Yeah.
because those are transcultural.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're in the collective unconscious.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Not just individuals, but
No.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
maybe that was a misunderstanding.
You
But the interesting part is that this knowledge is worldwide existing. It's not really fixed to one specific culture, and that's the interesting part of these elements.
Well, we're going to have dinner, so we can pursue this.
Sure.
But
Yeah, sorry.
But my other question is, if this is the case, and I think there's evidence for it, it's a very controversial idea. How does a designer tap into this? Is it just through the imagination, through dreaming, through? Or does it express itself just naturally?
Well, first of all, if you acknowledge or if you understand that's my interpretation, that many of the designs that we come up with are linked to certain archetypal understandings. For example, the forest clearing is an archetype. I don't have to explain what a clearing is all about. And if you look at all the structures we have in urban planning, architecture, landscape architecture, that the clearing as an archetype comes up every once in a while, I think that's a good knowledge to know that it's an archetype and to understand that it's read by people all around the world in kind of the same way. And if you have kind of I wouldn't call it a catalog of archetypes, sounds stupid, but if you know that, or if you have let's say if the students are in a situation where they ask themselves, how can I make people read what I'm designing? And they know that there are forms out there, for example, or structures out there that have an archetypal quality to it, they might intelligently incorporate that into their design and by that make sure that people are able to read and understand what it's all about. Again, if we understand landscape architecture once more as a nonverbal language, and we want to give people a chance to read, to understand what we're doing about, then the archetypes are very interesting pieces of vocabulary we can implement. And to use that, I think, is an interesting point. I wouldn't go so far that I say all design is just a reinterpretation of archetypes that has been out there all the time. But as a matter of fact, that's what the structuralists essentially also said. We're not inventing things completely new, but we're building our new language on a lot of existing elements and structures. And it would be stupid to say we'll reinvent everything new. That would be, that's why they sometimes said it's a very stupid idea to work from a plain, to understand language as a plain, or how do you say, a white piece of paper without any information on it. That's never true. There's always something you can relate to, and you should relate to. That's the interesting point, because it also puts the historians and the contemporary designers into contact, and I think that's another thing that I'm very interested in, and not separate these two things.
Udo, this is great for a number of reasons. Hermann Hertzberger was the Thomas Jefferson Medalist 2 years ago, and to have him here, really at the suggestion of a lot of faculty who see him as a precursor to rule-based or parametric design, it just made me start to think about some potential connections that you might want to think about. So on the one hand, there's the reinterpretation of Dutch structuralism in light of parametric, rule-based design. On the other hand, as you were talking about the versatility of a system like this, it sounded an awful lot like Gene Likens and S.T.A. Pickett's theories of shifting patch dynamics and their landscape ecological reading of cities, that cities are healthy not because they stay the same, but there's a particular quality to the patchy dynamics of the mosaic in the city. But the mosaic changes. A block may be fallow at one time and built at another, but there's an understanding and a support of the corridors and the patches and the matrix that give it its health. And so somewhere between landscape ecology, parametrics, and this?
Yes, but I'm a little bit reluctant to go into to buy into the parametric design, quite frankly, because maybe I just have a very superficial understanding of that. I have to admit that, but parametric design for me has this a little bit of risky part of it, because it begins to propose the idea if you put all the parameters in a big world formula, things will work out just by itself,
No,
and that's something I wouldn't buy into.
But you have to select the parameters relative to the health of the system.
Yeah, I know.
In the same way here, it's not any archetype and any structure.
Well, again, it's what I don't like about this parametric approach, probably. But again, I'm only have experience because I met Greg Lynn when he was teaching at the ETH in Zurich, and I saw what he was doing with his parametric design, and I was asking myself, like, first of all, yes, it's interesting that you include some parameters in your design, but on the other hand, you just at a certain moment push the stop button and say now it's finished, the calculation. That's what I like. That's something that I have really a bit of a problem with, and also this inclination. I hope it's the right word. This idea that we are able to get all parameters right, and then this is naturally ending up, and so that's something I'm very, very skeptical about.
So there's another way to think of it we can talk about later.
Sure.
But
yeah. No, that's.
I really, even to separate it out from that, seeing it in relationship to landscape ecology is something that is dynamic and patchy, right? The mosaic is where the structure is, but the parts of that mosaic change is so similar.
I know. Beth, you see, the point is that that's my own motivation to think about that stuff. I could easily do other things, but what I'm looking for personally, and that's my passion, so to say, is to find kind of an underlying principle that helps us to talk about all these different approaches, but that helps us to understand the underlying fundamental principle. Because I think, it's getting complicated by itself, that's for sure. And I'm very happy if someone's able to give me some like a base that I can build on, and then from there go into different. So I think it's very interesting what you say. And now the question is the hen and the egg. Doesn't matter, but. If this is a mode of explaining certain connections, I think that will help us. And I would not want to discuss like, forget about ecology, it's all structuralism. That would be stupid. But maybe this understanding will help us. Maybe that's another idea. This understanding will help us to establish a dialogue on a different level, on a meta level. We don't have to come up with other discussions. Where I'm having momentarily heavy discussions is the question about ecosystem services and green infrastructure. That's where we really have some heavy discussions going on, because that's the new fashion momentarily.
Thank you for a great lecture. I was thinking about the theory.
The anthropologist.
I think it sounds quite nice to make spaces that work for all people in all conditions and all cultures, but I wonder to what extent that's possible or desirable, because in a way, it sounds quite nice, but in the wrong hands, it sounds normalizing in a way, and I wonder if that's come up for you before, if in a way by trying to make this work for everyone, by developing archetypes, someone decides the archetypes and someone decides the structure, the sort of elements that are then interchangeable. And I guess I'm thinking about in anthropology, the response to structuralism was that everything is incredibly particular. And this is also an approach to landscape, an approach to gardens that I think is a really worthy response to the capitalization of landscape. And in a way, it's like, yeah, I don't know, maybe I've said enough, but these are sort of
but help me to understand, where do
Sure.
you see the danger? I mean, in terms of, that's something I'd like to understand a bit better.
Yeah, I guess the
Where you
danger
see-
being that if it works for everyone, that implicitly it works for the majority.
Okay.
And maybe that, I mean, maybe that's not true. Other people can sort of chime in, but
No. But I'm trying to think about that, you know, and think about projects that have this quality, and are they exclusive? Now, of course, since we're living in a society, as you all well know, especially in us in Germany, where we have to deal with a lot of inequalities, you know. I'm not afraid of things getting unequal. You know what I'm trying to say? It's like, I'd rather do something to avoid inequality and to do something against that. So I'm not so much afraid of going too equal. Let's put it that way. Because our society is there's forces that, you know, are doing that, and I don't have to take care of that. I think as a landscape architecture, I would rather, if I had to make a choice, I would rather go into one direction, maybe saying, okay, it would be great. And I witnessed that. If you go to Munich, for example, the English landscape garden, the English garden, that's not a good example, because that's so protected in terms of history that it's not so easy to use. But there's other parks, and you see how, for example, the Turkish people use the same park, and how they relate to these archetypes of landscape, and it's great, you know. They just use it because they understand that this is also done for them. They're not feel excluded. They feel invited. They use the space. And it's with many other cultural groups, especially now in Europe, that there are spaces that have this quality of everybody understands. You don't have to put up a sign. Everybody knows exactly what's going on. And that's what I appreciate as a quality for, again, I'm not talking about a private garden of a very rich person, you know, that can be exclusively, okay, fine. If you can have that, do that. I'm talking about, or I'm interested in the structure where the majority of our people live, and not the chosen few. Sorry, maybe but
I mean, I had a
Sure.
similar question. I
Sure.
think it came up when you said, in Germany, we have a lot of immigration occurring at the moment,
Yeah.
and there's a diversification of the population. So we have to design the spaces that they are open to everyone. So that they kind of, and my question was a little bit, yes, for sure, public space has to be open to everyone, because otherwise it's not a public space. But there is a cultural characteristic to spaces and to urban public spaces that are actually unique to a culture. So
Right.
a public space in Germany is different from a culture or a public space in a Mediterranean city or in a Islamic city, because these spaces are crafted through a cultural understanding that is actually different from Christianity. And I think there's a uniqueness about this. And I once heard a very interesting interview with an anthropologist who said culture needs, to some degree, a form of exclusiveness in order to become culture, because otherwise it becomes generic and becomes nothing. And that, and I find to some degree, and I totally agree, coming from Europe, public spaces have to be open, and there's an incredible value about public spaces that are multifunctional, that can become all kinds, from Christmas market to flea market to political spaces, or spaces that are just empty because they are open for appropriation. But there is something about
Yeah, I know. But
cultural
it's
space
interesting
that
if you're
actually
saying
needs
they
to be
has to be
unique.
to a certain degree specific. And the question is, what degree? Because the underlying, let's say, that's when we were talking about the archetypes, right? The archetypal form is there worldwide. You'll find the plaza, you know, the round-shaped plaza all over the world. But now comes the specific cultural, let's say, interpretation of that. And it would be, and I think it would be misunderstanding if I would say, you know, let's create white cubes all over the world, and everybody can use them. No. I totally agree that we have to this. There is a certain site specificity to all these elements. That's why, for example, the High Line in New York, that's something you can't have everywhere and anywhere because there is a certain cultural background. But it is what you're saying is the degree, and that's maybe something where I said, okay, but let's agree upon the fact that there are some basic qualities that all these spaces have all together, a basic quality, and then on top comes like a secondary or tertiary quality to it, and maybe that makes the specificity in the end.
I mean, I was thinking that the archetypes might vary from culture to culture. I mean, when I stay in the realm of the architectural archetype,
for example,
a Christian church has a specific archetype versus the atrium mosque is a completely. They are both spaces to practice religion, but they are very different spatial and their spatial composition, because in Islam you have the relationship to the sky that is very important, the sky and the ground. So,
but if it depends on your understanding of archetype. But if you understand archetype as this is the archetype of gathering spaces, then there are essentially and covered gathering spaces. Then they are essentially the same in their basic quality, but they have, as you rightly said, and I think that's good. They have different cultural, modifications. Specificities. But the basic, and I mean that's what, the anthropologist should help me, right? To say, man is everywhere the same, all over the world, and Claude Lévi-Strauss was, as far I understood, was the one who said, we're all the same. There is not primitive and advanced. We're all the same. The only difference is that we have different technical means in terms of our society to react to certain impulses. So he said, for example, fire. We all react in the same way intuitively if we see fire breaking out. But it's different whether you have a fire extinguisher on the wall or if you're camping out in the countryside, you have nothing. But the instinctive reaction to it is everywhere the same. So that's something that I thought like we can. I know it's not really thought through completely, and I'm this is a work in progress. I have to admit that because I was just sitting, doing a little bit on that work. But so there's a lot to resolve. But there is components from anthropology and I think also from linguistics that might be valuable for our interpretation, and that's why I'm so stressing the point that I'm talking about the landscape structuralism, because I would like to encourage other people to think in that and say, maybe it's our interpretation as landscape architects that might help us to solve our problems. I'm not interested in solving the problems of everybody else. I'm happy if we have in landscape architecture a certain approach to certain problems that might help us. And again, if you can use it, it's fine. If you cannot use it, forget it. Take another one, as long as you reach your aim.
Thanks, Udo. This was great. I just wanted to add a kind of historical dimension to this. I mean, it's interesting that you started out in forestry, and forestry was really the first, scientific management. It was very important in kind of rationalizing the land, and then anthropologists were working on kind of challenging the environmental economics for decades in the mid 20th century, along with other social scientific fields. And of course, the background here is capitalism, and it's shaping the landscape. So in our kind of neoliberal era, what hope do you have that this, that renewing this very powerful critique, what can we do to go beyond Aldo von Eyck and Lévi-Strauss and people who were looking really to non-Western cultures to criticize Western ways of organizing space. But how can we go beyond that in our current economic entanglement?
Good question.
Minor question.
I wish I had a clear answer to that, because that's what I'm just beginning to understand how we get there. But first of all, I think it's a first step to be clear about certain points and to be outspoken about it, and that's one of the experiments I'm doing with my students momentarily to experimentally find out how far we can get with this and how far we can implement these strategies. But that's very generally, I think it depends on each and every one of us whether we're willing to defend certain values out there against this neoliberalistic approach. And that means sometimes you have to take a clear point of view and have to, don't be afraid of getting out of your comfort zone. I think that's the only way to make a difference. But that's a very general answer to your very specific question, I'm afraid. But as far as we can, as your question is concerned, how can we go beyond Aldo von Eyck and these? I don't have an answer to that yet. I'm sorry.
I see several questions, but we have a reception outside, and I think we can actually continue the questions in that context. So please join me in thanking Udo for his great contribution.
Thanks. Thank you.